Okay, so let's take a look. We had started the biurim yesterday. We'll start it again. Matsui hadavar, right? So we were talking about the the general concept of using contracts to solidify a transaction. So matzoi hadavar she'adam holech al mitavech v'hamitavech machtim oto al shtar muchan u'menusach. He says what's prevalent is that a person will go to a broker. The broker will have him sign a shtar that is already filled out. Shimhu yikna o yiskar that if the person will end up purchasing or renting a house or residence that the agent presents to him, he will owe the broker a certain amount of money or a certain percentage. So he places the contract in front of him and has the person sign. He says, what we should deliberate over is that a binding agreement when someone puts something in front of you and you sign it? Especially if you never took possession of the shtar. Many times the signature is done without ever even picking up the paper from off the desk, off the table. Just puts it in front of you and you sign. But you didn't take possession of the shtar. So was there really a transaction that took place through the signature? This question pertains to other situations where an obligation is generated through the signature of a contract. That Ruvain obligates himself to provide or give to Shimon a particular object or sum. Shimon prepares the contract, Ruvain signs it. Also very common is that when you sign a retainer for a lawyer, okay, and the lawyer prepares a contract. He has the two sides. Let's say maybe it's not a retainer, but let's say it's a mediation agreement or some other kind of agreement. He has the two sides sign the piece of paper. But neither party can really say that they are sort of the owner over the shtar. Neither party has taken possession of the shtar. And the same thing applies to a bill of sale. We find from the Talmudic perspective that whenever a person is agreeing to a sale or obligating himself in some other way, he has to take possession of the shtar that represents the obligation and then deliver it to the other party. He says the Gemara in Gittin talks about the concept of a get, which is also, the scroll itself has to be representative of the transaction. So the shtar starts off in the possession of the seller. V'lo mo'il im hakone katav al niyar shelo v'hamocher chatmo. And it doesn't help, according to the Gemara, if the paper belongs to the purchaser and the seller just signs it. Ba'ayin biktzos Choshen dekosav zilashano. Umavuar dishtar kinyan lo mahani ad shia niyar b'hu ashtar shel hamocher. The ba'ina and sefer hamikneh. He says the transaction only is affected through a shtar when the paper actually belongs to the seller or the debtor or whoever is drawing it up. Be'afal gav de halokeach notein schar hasofer tzorchu lachzor ulahaknoto lemocher b'chdei sheyeh hamocher chozer umaknelo et hashtar. He says part of the affectation of the transaction is through the transfer of ownership of the piece of paper from the seller to the buyer. And if the seller does not own the contract and does not transfer it over to the buyer, how else can you affect that kinyan? Okay, v'uadin shtar hakna dechadino. The kevin dahalokech notein schar hasofer tzarch lahaknoto lemocher. He says, and therefore, in a situation where the buyer is drawing up the bill of sale, he has to actually make sure that the seller takes possession of the bill of sale and then transfers it back to the buyer. He says, I don't understand why the poskim don't make a bigger issue of this, that the paper has to belong to the seller, person who's transacting over to the buyer. Imkain b'shtari didan kevin dahalokech notein schar hasofer ve'enu maknei lemocher nira below mahani lekinyan adkan l'shana. He says, and therefore it would appear, says the Ktsos Choshen, who lives in the 18th century, it would appear, he says, maybe 19th, go into the 19th century, it appears that this kind of transaction has not been affected, even though there's a contract to represent the sale, but in a situation where the seller never took possession of the paper, it seems like there's been a significant flaw in the method of transaction. And the same thing with any kind of promissory note, the debtor has to take possession of it and transfer it over to the creditor. So I want to get to the bottom line because this is a very, very lengthy piece. And, even though there's going to be some flaw here, he says, Ula meidach gisa gami mashtar lo baliyado rakunach lefana v'chatam alav. He says, on the other hand, we could argue that if a paper was just placed in front of you and you signed it, yesh ladun bo keshenasa al yedei orech din shu adam shlishi, if it was done via a lawyer who's a third party, al pi ma shekasav hator b'shem harama, v'im amar le'idim kisvu getu tenu leishti, that the Torah writes that if a person tells two Eidim, take a piece of paper and write a get and give it to my wife, ein tzorech lizkot lo haniyar kodem k'tiva. The witnesses do not have to take possession on behalf of the husband of that piece of paper. It's as if they gave the paper to the husband because they're not a party of interest. The get he says, even though this is not brought by the Shulchan Aruch itself, but the poskim do discuss this when it comes to transactions, and therefore it certainly should be effective. He says, it could be, you could argue, that when a third party drafts the paper, it's as if the third party has taken possession on behalf of the person who needs to possess it in order for the transaction to work. But he says it's not clear. And he goes through other reasons why it will work. Okay. Is that right? So the person who's drawing up the contract, the broker, right? Interesting. So just to get after, we won't go through the whole rigmarole, but he says, just to the bottom line, he says, Nira dahagam de efshar de b'di'evid yesh makom lahamlitz lahachshir hadavar b'torat situmta kidinit ba'er. We could say that b'di'evid, we could declare any kind of signed contract to be kosher based on the principle of situmta, which is basically once there's a convention of doing things, a social convention, it becomes legal. And also based on the fact that if it's done by a third party, you could make that argument as well. But he says, you know what? It's not so clear halachically. And therefore, whenever you'd like to make a contract legally binding, if you're the party that's obligating yourself, it's important to take possession of the shtar before you give it back to the other party. And therefore, if you're a party in a transaction, always make sure that the party that is committing himself to sell or to pay or to deliver or whatever it is, make sure that if you're signing a contract on that, make sure that the party that's obligating themselves takes possession of the paper. Say, do me a favor, lift up that paper if you don't mind. And therefore, when a lawyer sets up a bill of sale between a seller and a buyer, and he wants to get the seller's signature, first he should tell him, Mr. Cohen, please take possession by lifting up the paperwork that I've prepared for you. And then and then afterwards he should deliver it to the buyer. And you should do the same thing anytime you're creating a transactional connection between two parties. Make sure that whichever party is obligating themselves, and sometimes it's both parties, are obligating, like one party is obligating themselves to deliver goods, the other party is obligating to pay cash or whatever it is. What you should do is make sure that both parties take possession of the paper, right? So that each party is in some way affecting the transaction through an exchange of paper. Okay. So that's what he concludes. He says, yes, it's true that in many instances you could rely on, Dina de Malchusa, the law of the land, social convention, the lawyer preparing the paper, acquiring it on your behalf. But it's best that whenever you're affecting a transaction between two Yid, between two Jews, make sure that each side picks up their paper in order to affect the transaction. Good. That's a great question. But electronic today, everything is electronic. Yeah, but that's the problem. There's been no. You got to pick up the laptop. Yeah. These are all good questions. I get a sense that as technology has changed, it becomes more difficult to fulfill this particular criterion. And so you would probably have to rely on the leniencies that he's built into this. He says, B'di'evid, you can certainly rely on the fact that it's a legal transaction without picking up the paper, but lechatchila it's best to, right? Like you said, modern technology doesn't necessarily allow me to do that. So yeah, you're right. There still is a packing slip, but a lot of times with real estate, there's not, everything. Right, but more and more, these things are being done electronically. Yeah. What? That's right. Yeah. Okay. So I think we've done all of the Imrei Yaakov on this. So let's take a look at the next seif. Okay, Chaf Aleph. Im ein ha'edim kosvim ba'atzmam hashtar. This is a really pertinent halacha. If the witnesses themselves to a transaction have not written the shtar themselves, ein rishayim lachtom ad sheyikra'uhu techila mila b'mila. They are not allowed to sign on a contract until they read the entire contract verbatim. V'yavinu heitev kol hakasuv bo, and they have to understand everything that is written in that piece of paper. And what if they can't understand it all? Let's say it's written in Aramaic, right? Let's say I'm a witness on a ksuba and I don't understand the text. So yikra'u v'yifreshu lahem shnayim acherim. Then two other people should read it and translate it and explain it to them. Shehem kasherim v'ne'emanim u'ru'im lahayit, provided that those other two people are themselves kosher witnesses. V'achar kach yachtamu, and only then and only then may the witnesses sign the contract. That's right. Two people that understand it, which is not what we do today with a ketubah or with a tanoim or with any of that stuff. Okay, hold on. And lechatchila, you should never use witnesses who themselves do not have the ability to read and understand the contract themselves. It's not ideal. It's not ideal to have this chain, right? So what do we do with the ketubah? I once gave a shir on this, a sugya shir, but let's take a look at how the Imrei Yaakov handles this. Now, this is not just if it's in Aramaic. Let's say you have a 40-page document and someone calls you in and says, here, I need witnesses on this document. I'm sure that happens. And it's written in legalese and they don't read it. I've signed things that I haven't read. That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Problems arise when they say they sign it and everything's fine until it's not fine. And then they say, well, I never read it. It's not my fault. And the law is that you had the opportunity to read it, you should have read it, and you didn't understand, it's your problem. Right?
Yeah. No one put a gun to your head to sign. Have there been cases where the contract was not upheld because the party didn't understand?
Yeah. A concept called non-est factum, which is Latin for it's not my signature. So there are parameters about that, but carelessness and neglect and all that is usually not a defense. But The person legitimately says, he bamboozled me, and their language wasn't exactly clear. Yeah, you can get out of it. But not because he didn't deliberately sign it because they were in a hurry or something. That's not.
At the desk there, and you just gotta sign, you know.
And there's a clause that's 20 minutes behind you in line. And there's a clause at the end. And understood that everything at the end. That clause, which you have to get over also, is now you're lying. Now you signed it instead. I've read it. Now you're stopped from saying you didn't, but still, sometimes.
Okay. I just realized we didn't finish all of the Imrei Yaakov on this previous sif. So we'll get back to this halach in just a moment. But what we should see are these last two pieces in the Imrei Yaakov from the previous sif, which is the following halacha. That's right. He says, "V'chein bishtar matana." So he says, "V'im achar hakinyan omar hamocher stam kisvu shtar mechira v'lo omar sheitnu liyado." If after a transaction is effected, the seller or the debtor says to the witnesses, "Write up a paper to the effect of this bill of sale," he doesn't have to say explicitly, "Give it to him," right? But the witnesses understand that that's implicit. Unless he says explicitly, "Hold on to it until I tell you." V'chein bishtar chov sheish bo kinyan, aval im lo kanu miyado. But this is the last part that we didn't look at the Imrei Yaakov yet. But if no kinyan was made, if there was no transaction made, afal pi shamar lahem kisvu tnulo, even though the witnesses were not witness to an actual legal transaction, to an actual legal kinyan, but the seller says to the witnesses, "Go ahead and draw a paper of a bill of sale and give it to him." They have to consult with the seller after they draw up the paper and sign it before they actually deliver it to the buyer. Because we don't know, since there was no legal kinyan made yet on the sale, the witnesses should not give it to the purchaser until they consult one last time with the seller. He tells them, draw up the paper, give it to the buyer. They draw it up, they sign it. Before they deliver it, they should consult one last time with the seller. Do you want us to give it to him? And similarly, when there is a debtor who agrees that he's going to pay back $10,000 to Reuven, Shimon says, "I'm going to pay $10,000 to Reuven. I'm going to owe him that money. Please draw up the paper and you can give it to him." Since the witnesses did not witness a transaction, a kinyan, they do have to consult with the debtor before they deliver that piece of paper. And so the Imrei Yaakov simply says, "Tzrichim lachzor u'limalech v'chein b'shtar chov shein bo kinyan v'davar zeh nechlaku aposkim." He says here there is a machlokas aposkim. He says, this is actually a machlokas, says the Imrei Yaakov. The Rab Shulchan Aruch is going like the Rambam. But some say that once a person has given you instructions to deliver that paper, you don't have to consult with him a second time before you deliver the paper. Aval hashach kasav da harambam yachidu b'davar zeh ushar rishonim lo svir luhu kain ela ki yesh omim shein sarach lihimalech. And the Shach says that we don't paskin like the Rambam, like the Rav Shulchan Aruch says, and therefore the witnesses do not have to consult with the debtor party before delivering the paper. Achein za'amarak b'mechor shtar chov aval b'ksuva ushtar matana l'kul yalma tzrichim lihimalech bo. But that's only when it comes to a contract, which is a promissory note or a bill of sale. That's where the Shach says We don't paskin like the Rambam. We don't paskin like the Rav Shulchan Aruch. The witnesses don't have to consult a second time, even though they were not witness to a transaction. But with a ksuva, if let's say a man says, write a ksuva for my wife and give it to her, if he didn't make a kinyan, they have to consult with him. That's not really a relevant halacha today, because we always make a kinyan with the chatan. So that's not really relevant. But if it's a shtar matana, a bill of gift, right? So let's say Reuven says, I'm going to gift my house to Shimon. Draw up paper and give it to Shimon, but they didn't see a kinyan, so they have to consult with him according to everybody before they deliver it. I don't know why there's that distinction drawn in halacha. It could be because there's been no consideration, that word in legalese, which means when you give a gift, there's been no quid pro quo. You're not receiving anything in return. So therefore, they have to really be careful to reconsult with the gifter in order to make sure he wants to go through with it. Okay, Shema Chazar Bo Hamocher, because you never know, maybe the seller will have had a change of heart. Vida de shtar mecher o kinyan mamon tzorach lios kanoi hashtar tchila lemakne v'huim serena l'lekona. This last piece is based on what we saw in the Biurim. Rav Stern writes, you have to make sure that the actual paper that the agreement is drawn on belongs to the seller, and then he transfers ownership of the paper from the seller to the buyer. Ve'ilo lo kana klal. And if that doesn't happen, then the piece of paper is not legally binding. Below kamoshanogim lifa'amim shahakona kosiv al niyar shalo o mitzaveh lichtov v'lachtom biyadiat hamalva ve'ena shtar bali aramakne klal. And it's not like some people do today, where the person who's the creditor or the buyer draws up the paper, just has the seller or the debtor sign without ever picking up the paper and making it his own. In which case, the person who's indebting himself to sell or to pay back has not acquired the shtar at all. And it's not an effective kinyan. And you have to let sofrim, scribes who are involved in these transactions know, because a lot of people don't know this. So basically, he says, I refer you to the Biurim, but he says, really, lechatchila, like he said at the end of the Biurim, you really have to try to be careful to make sure that there is actual transfer of paper from one party to the other. Otherwise, there are questions in halacha. Okay. Yeah, it could create potential problems. But as he concluded in the Biurim, it's all lechatchila, b'di'evid, and certainly I believe Barry's point is needs to be taken into consideration when technology changes. You can rely on those poskim who say that you don't have to actually transfer paper. Okay, we'll hold it, and then we'll continue our halacha tomorrow about when the witnesses don't know what they're signing. Okay, we'll talk about that tomorrow.